Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I want to give you guys an introduction to the Fusion page of DaVinci Resolve for beginners. So before we move over to the Fusion page, I want to explain what you do on it first. So generally, the Fusion page is used when you want to create effects on your clips or independence of your clips. That can include things like titles, blur effects, particle effects, or 3D related activities such as importing a 3D model, rendering that inside of the Fusion editor, and then rendering that out to a 2D image so that you can use it inside of your final video. So generally there's going to be two common setups you use before you go move into the Fusion page and you start using nodes to edit your effects. One option is that you have a video clip in your timeline and you want to apply an effect to it that does not already exist inside of the effects library, top left, and then scrolling through the toolbox you can see some of the default effects. So out of the box in DaVinci Resolve, you have many video transitions and 3D titles, which you can use just by dragging and dropping onto your clips or onto your timeline. But with the Fusion page, you're able to create similar effects with pretty much unlimited customization, or to whip up stuff that doesn't really exist out of the box in Resolve. So when you want to create an effect for a timeline clip, you would first do the basic editing of your timeline clip, and then you can select that and move over to the Fusion page, where this will be your media input, and you do stuff to it on Fusion page to get that clip with the edited effects and push that to your output. The second option, when you want to start completely from scratch, is to use a Fusion composition. So in the effects library, you can find under effects, there is Fusion composition here. So whenever you want to put a Fusion composition, which can really just be thought of as any 3D or special effect, you can drag this onto your timeline as a completely blank video clip. So if I push this onto video track 1 in front of this first clip, and we position the timeline cursor, you'll see it's just a pure black output. So when you want to start from scratch, you use a Fusion composition, but if you want to edit an already existing clip, it can be easier to just put the clip in the timeline, cut it to the parts you want to keep in your final product, and then edit that instead of starting from scratch. So when you have a clip or a Fusion composition selected, you can go over to the Fusion page, which is on the middle at the bottom. If you hover over it, it'll say Fusion. And when we get to this page, you'll probably notice a few distinct sections. Notably at the bottom, this section called Nodes. This is where you'll set up the bulk of your effects inside of Fusion. And the idea of these nodes is that they will have inputs and outputs connecting with each other in order to create your more complicated special effect. So you can see here that by default with a basic video clip, you have a media in, which in this case is the clip that you put on your timeline. And it's connected with this output pin to the input pin for media out. So basically, we're taking the input clip and we're pushing that forward to media out so that it can be rendered in the final product. If you looked at any regular clip inside of DaVinci Resolve, this is what you would see by default. So the idea is that in order to add an effect, we would have to add extra nodes that go somewhere between media in and media out. So a lot of your commonly used nodes are going to be located in the toolbar right above where it says nodes. So you can see things here like bringing in a background image, adding a text plus element, basically a basic title that you can edit the settings on in the inspector over on the right side. Things like a color corrector node, giving you another place to modify the color in your video other than the color page, which is over to the right of the Fusion tab. Nodes like blur, which can be used to blur out the entire image or a section of the video. Transform nodes, which can be used to adjust the positioning or the rotation of any input nodes that feed into it. So for instance, if you selected media in here and then clicked on transform, that would add a transform node between media in and media out. And then you'd be able to adjust the input media in, the video clip, in certain ways, such as changing the positioning or the rotation of that clip. So I could take the center X of the transform, move that over to the right, and then that's actually going to adjust the positioning of the video clip. So you can see in this right preview area, it says media out 1 up here. So that is basically what you would be seeing at the step of media out, the final part of the node page. And you know that that node is being selected for the preview window because there's a little section right below the media out node. You'll see 2 dots here for the 2 preview windows. left view and right view. So if you want to see how the clip would look at any point during your node setup, then you can put that up on a preview window. So I can take media in and left click on left view to see how it would look at the stage of media in. So before I actually add any effects to the media in, this is how it looks. And somewhere in between media in and media out, we get that transform effect where we're basically just shifting the position over to the right. Now, generally you wouldn't do something that pointless or simple, but hopefully you can see how these nodes are what makes the adjustment to your video clip and then are able to give you that edited result. So I could change this transform node by hitting Control X on it, and I could also put a blur node between media in and media out by clicking on blur on the hotbar. Note that when you have a node selected in your timeline and you click on one of the toolbar shortcuts, it's going to add and automatically connect the node right after the one you currently have selected. So you can see here it already did the connections between media in, blur, and then blur to media out. But if I didn't have that selected and I just clicked blur, then it would be its own independent node. So at some point you'll probably need to manually do the connections between your nodes for one reason or another. If you want to break a node connection, then go to the right side of that and then double click on the line, and then that should break the connection. And if you want to connect one node to another node, then take, let's say, the output of media 1, this pin here, drag that into the input, which is always going to be the orange pin, and then that makes a connection. The output feeds into the input for blur, and then the blur takes over and applies an effect to whatever is the input. And so we can take the media out of the blur, basically whatever the input was now with the blur effect added, and connect that to the media out. So now with this blur node, let's actually blur the image out a little bit. I'll just take this blur size in the inspector. By the way, if you don't have it open, it's in the top right hand corner, so just click inspector to make sure that it pops open here. But we'll take the blur size and increase it. So the more blur you want, the more you increase the size. And just like on the edit page, you can actually animate pretty much all of these properties by clicking on these keyframe diamonds over on the right side. So if I go to frame 40 here and I check the keyframe diamond, then that would mean at that point, frame 40 of this video clip, it's going to have a blur size of 33.9. And obviously that looks quite blurry. But if we go to frame 0, and now we change the blur size to 0, it's going to keyframe that as well. And now it's going to animate between the blur size of 0, which I just set it to the 33.9 at the second keyframe. And you can click on the left and right arrows to see how it transforms between those two keyframes. So keyframing works just like it does on the Edit tab, which is very important for Fusion if you want to create animated effects. Okay, so another thing I want to point out is that the effects here don't have to be completely linear, and there can be multiple inputs and outputs for many of the nodes. So if you look at the blur node here, and let's zoom in a little bit. Let's zoom in a little bit by scrolling on the middle mouse wheel. So if you look at the blur effect here, you'll also notice that there is a blue pin on the top side. And if we hover over it, it says Effect Mask. So a mask is where you define part of your image or your video clip where you want an effect to take place, or the opposite, you can invert it, and you can define which part of the image do you want to not apply the effect to. And generally for a mask, you'll use a shape. Now note, I'm not talking about the shape 3D node over here. That's something different when you're actually doing 3D effects, which we'll get to in a second. But if you want to add a 2D shape, then you can right-click, go to Add Tool, go down to Mask, and you can choose something like ellipse if you want a circle or an oval shape, or rectangle if you want a square, or just any rectangle in general. And by the way, this is also how you would get to all of the nodes that you don't actually see on the toolbar up there. You can see, if you go through this a little bit, that there's actually quite a lot of nodes. So you can get really in-depth with the Fusion page if you want to. So let's go ahead and add in a ellipse mask. Actually, let's make it a rectangle mask. And you can see when we have this rectangle node added here and selected that there is the gizmos for this mask. So you can see the boundaries at which this mask would apply if we connect it to the effect mask of the blur. So basically define the regions of where you want the blur to take place or not to take place. So let's stretch these edges here. And when we do that, you'll notice that the values in the inspector change. So you could also edit the values in the inspector as well if you want to. Generally, the gizmos make it a little bit more visual, so I'd say that's the preferred way to go. So now we can take the output of this mask and connect it to the effect mask pin of the blur node. And, well, we can't see it right now because we're at frame 0, but if we go into the timeline where the blur actually is there, such as anything past frame 40, then you can see that the mask is now applying. The blur only takes place inside of that mask. Now, as I mentioned before, you can invert that, basically make it so that the inside of the rectangle is where it won't apply. So we can check this invert setting on the inspector, and then the only thing that gets blurred is everything on the outside. We could also add a little bit of a soft edge to the mask itself, so that the boundary between the blur and the non-blurred area isn't so sharp like a picture frame. We can make it a little bit softer by adding in this soft edge, and when we do that, it becomes a lot less obvious where the boundaries of that blur actually is. And if you ever need to, you can always go back to the rectangle and adjust the boundaries for that blur mask. So something I want to point out with the nodes section here is that you can make them quite complicated, and you can actually merge different effects together on the same Fusion composition or video clip. So for instance, I could create a 3D text effect, and I'm just going to go through this really quickly here. By clicking on text 3D, so we get a text 3D node, not seen on screen right now. And when you're dealing with anything 3D in DaVinci Resolve's Fusion page, you'll eventually need to render that out to a 2D image before you can actually feed it to media out, because everything that's in media out requires it to be 2D. So we'll need a renderer 3D node connected to that text 3D node. And then when we have this text rendering, we can actually combine that with the basic clip here. So these will basically be two separate entities, the base clip with the blur and a 3D text that's been rendered to 2D. And we can merge those together with a merge node. So if I right click, go to add tool, do composite, and then merge, you'll get this merge node. So now, if you hover over the pins here, you'll see that for a merge node, the orange one is the background, which is generally going to be your base video clip. And you can see that the green connector is the foreground, which is what's going to go in front of your video clip. So if we have a title, we want the title to be the foreground. So I'm going to click on this media out nodes connector between blur and cut that for a second. We're going to take the blurred media clip output and make that the background. And then we're going to take the rendered 3D text, which we haven't created anything of yet, really, and we're going to connect that to the foreground, the green pin. So now we have two nodes merged together inside of one. If I preview this on the right screen, you'll see that all of the nodes up to this point will show on screen. So if we actually type something into the text 3D node, selecting that, and say tutorial here, now we have all of the nodes merged together onto one, and you can actually see both the rendered 3D text effect and the blurred video clip. So now we just need to take this merged node and connect it to media out, and then that's how we can get our final result. So if you take a look at this, you can see it's not completely linear. Although we start with a media in, the media in can go to a blur effect, but this blur might not also apply to the text 3D that we set up here. So the fact that you can have your nodes set up like this makes it both very powerful and also increases the possibility of making it extremely complicated. So one of the things you can do if your node setup becomes a sprawling web of nodes and is confusing to look at is you can actually group your nodes. So we can take this 3D stuff up here and we can right click it and then go to group in order to make it its own thing, where if we ever need to edit the 3D stuff, we know where to go for it because it's all located inside of this group. We can hit F2 to rename it with it selected and then call it text effect. And anytime we want to dive into that group of nodes, we just double click on it and it will open it up here. So while it's not open, it's easier to understand. All we need to know is what it's supposed to do. But if we ever need to go back and edit the details, we have it grouped in its own separate area. And in that sense, you can kind of encapsulate the different areas that you're working on so that you don't confuse yourself too much. So likewise, we could take this stuff over here, right click it, go to group, and Control G with all your stuff selected is a shortcut which can do the same thing. And we could say edited video clip here. And so now we can kind of double click on them anytime we want to work on them independently and do the changes we need to. And if you have a group open already, you can just click on the X in the top left to close it up again. And this will make it look a little bit neater for your nodes grouping. Now, when you only have 2 or 3 nodes in each group, it's not that useful, but if you have, let's say, 20 or 30, hopefully you can see how that would be a bigger deal. Now, I do want to go touch on the fusion composition effect that we dragged into the timeline. So I'm actually going to just cut away this text effect entirely, and we'll make that a separate fusion composition. So if you want to take your effects and make them independent of each other, using fusion composition nodes would be one way you can do that, where you have effects layered on top of each other using the fusion composition nodes, and each one does a certain thing, rather than combining all your nodes on the same fusion page. So if we go back over to the Edit tab, we can take this fusion composition, and if we wanted that to be a title for our video clip, then we can just drag that over it in the timeline, control the duration to how long it should be. So we could just make it the length of the clip under it. Then we can click on it and go into the Fusion page once again. So back on the Fusion page for the Fusion composition, let's go ahead and add another title sequence into our video. So we have 2 different ways of adding a title. So we have text 3D and we have text plus. So if you want a text element to basically be a true 3D object and able to be modified by something like a spotlight inside of a 3D scene, where you can have lighting and materials and all of that stuff, then you probably want a text 3D element. But if you don't really need that stuff, you can still do 3D rotations, but not really have it be in a 3D scene. Then you can go ahead and use text plus elements. So if you're just keeping it simple, text plus is probably the way to go over here. So by clicking on the text plus node, we add that into our node composition, and we can click on left view in order to have that pop open on the top left preview window. So you can see here by default, we have just a transparent background. The resolution is the same as in our video timeline, and we can start typing in text. So we can put in here Fusion for beginners, and obviously we can change any of the properties for that text. There's an awful lot to go through here. And by the way, this would be the same as dropping in a text plus title directly onto the timeline in the edit page by default. The difference here is that with this text plus node, you can connect that into other nodes in Fusion in order to create more complicated effects. So we can go ahead and increase the size of this Fusion title by dragging on the properties in the inspector. So I'll increase the size here. What you'll notice if you look at the preview window, and let's zoom in a bit here with Control middle mouse wheel. Oh, I guess the gizmo size doesn't really change. But if you look closely, there is a green dotted line around the center of the text, and there is up and right arrows at the center point. So if you want to drag the position, you can do that using these gizmos. So click on an arrow and drag that left and right, or click on the up arrow and drag that up and down. If you click on the dotted circle, that will allow you to rotate it. And those gizmos basically control the same properties you would see over on the Layout tab of the inspector. So if you click on Layout, you can see the center X, which is controlled by the up, down, left, right adjustments. And if you click on Rotation, the rotation that this circle gizmos is doing is the Z rotation. But just like a 3D text node, you can also do Y and X rotation, so you can kind of get that 3D look here as well. So for this tutorial, we're not really going to go much further than this. Because this is a text plus element, we can directly connect it to media out, and we don't actually need a 3D Fusion renderer to take it from 3D into 2D. Feel free to add in some basic animation, such as going to frame 30 or so, and keyframing it at the center point, going to frame 0, and changing its starting location. So if you wanted it to be, let's say, top to bottom, you can control the position, making it appear off screen by default, and then over those 30 frames, your title can slide into position, just as one simple example. And now if we go over to the edit page, we'll be able to see that the 2 clips layered on top of each other can create your final video effects. So even though we did 2 different things inside of the Fusion page, we separated them, which can be a good idea at times. And now they can kind of play together. So over those 40 frames or so, we both have the title slide into position, and we also have the blur for the edges of the video clip start to fade in. And by the way, if you run into this common issue of the text not being very clear against the background, you could add drop shadow into it. So let's do that really quick for fun. Back on the Fusion page for the Fusion composition, click on the text, go over to the 4th tab over here. It's called shading. And I think the default is number 3 here for black shadow. So we can just enable that, and it will create a decent black drop shadow for your text. If we go back over to the edit page, we'll be able to see that that makes your text appear a little bit cleaner. One last thing to point out, you can actually shift between your timeline clips on the Fusion page by clicking on the clips dialog up here on the top left-hand corner. So you can go between video track 1 and video track 2 while you're editing them in the Fusion page. Hopefully in this video you guys have gotten the idea of how the Fusion page works, what the whole point of nodes are, a simple idea of how you can use them in conjunction with each other in order to create powerful video effects, how to connect pins, and what the difference between a Fusion composition clip is and any normal clip in your video timeline. So I've been Chris, that's going to be it for this video from me, and I will see you guys in my future DaVinci Resolve content.